Danny Cole had exactly 12,000 credits to his name, and he knew that number would not last long in the outer rim of colonized space. He walked through the crowded halls of Verax Station, with his hands in his pockets and his eyes scanning for the parts shop he needed to find. Because his cargo ship needed new engine filters, and he could not afford to break down in the empty void between stars. The station smelled like burnt metal and alien spices, and creatures from 100 different worlds pushed past him without a second glance. Because humans were still rare in this part of the galaxy, and most aliens did not know what to make of the small, soft beings from the distant blue planet called Earth. Danny had been hauling cargo for 6 years now, ever since he left his home colony to find something better out among the stars. But better had never come, and now he was just another broke hauler trying to survive one job at a time he turned down corridor and found himself facing a massive open doorway that led into a space he had not expected to find. The arena auction hall stretched before him like a nightmare made real, with hundreds of seats rising up around a central platform where beings stood in chains, waiting to be sold. Danny felt his stomach turn as he realized what this place was. He had heard about Gladiator auctions on stations like this one, places where fighters who could no longer perform in the pits were sold off to whoever wanted them. And the buyers were never kind people with good intentions. He should have turned around and walked away. But something held him in place as the auctioneer, a thin reptilian creature with too many teeth, began calling out the next lot. The guards brought her onto the platform, and Danny felt his breath catch in his throat. She was massive, standing nearly 8 feet tall with scales that shimmered blue and silver under the harsh lights. And she had 4 arms that hung heavy with muscle, despite the chains that bound them together. Her species was called Torvani, and Danny had heard stories about their warriors, beings bred for combat who could tear through armored soldiers like paper. But this one was broken. Could see it in the way she favored her right leg, which bent at an angle that told him the bones had shattered and healed wrong, and he could see it in her eyes. Those deep amber eyes that held nothing but defeat and exhaustion. Auctioneer laughed as he presented her to the crowd. Lot 47, he announced with cruel amusement in his voice. A Torvani female, 15 years in the pits. Over 200 confirmed kills, but look at that leg. She cannot fight anymore, cannot run, can barely walk. Starting bid at 8,000 credits for anyone who wants cheap labor, or perhaps something to mount on their wall. The crowd laughed, and Danny felt anger rise in his chest like fire. Acrylic slaver raised his appendage and called out 8,000. And a mining company representative countered with 8,500. And they went back and forth in lazy bids while the Torvani stood there, with her head bowed like she had accepted whatever fate awaited her. Danny looked at his credit balance on his wrist display and saw the number 12,000. Staring back at him, that was everything he had in the universe. Enough for fuel and food for maybe 2 months, if he was careful. And spending it here would leave him with nothing. But he could not stop looking at her eyes. He remembered the stories his grandmother used to tell him about Earth's history, about the humans who had fought and died to end slavery on their world, about the ones who had given everything they had to say that no person should ever be property. His grandmother had always said that being human meant standing up when standing up cost you something. 12,000 credits, Danny called out, and his voice cracked slightly as every head in the auction hall turned to look at him. The auctioneer blinked his many eyes in confusion. The human bids 12,000, he said slowly, as if he could not quite believe what he was hearing. Does anyone wish to counter? The acrylic slaver looked at Danny with what might have been disgust, and the mining representative shook his head and muttered something about damaged goods not being worth that price. The Torvani lifted her head and stared at Danny with an expression he could not read. 12,000 once, the auctioneer called. 12,000 twice, and sold to the human. Come collect your property, small creature, and good luck with whatever you plan to do with her. The crowd laughed again as Danny made his way down to the platform. And he could feel their eyes on him, judging him, wondering what kind of fool would spend everything on a broken warrior. The guards handed him the ownership documents and unlocked the chains from the Torvani's wrists. And she stood there rubbing the raw skin where the metal had dug into her scales. She was so much larger up close. And Danny had to crane his neck back just to meet her eyes. Come on, he said quietly. My ship is in docking bay 17. She did not move at first, just stared down at him with those amber eyes that held suspicion and confusion and something that might have been fear. What do you want from me, human? She asked, and her voice was deep and rough like stones grinding together. I want to get out of this place, Danny said honestly. We can talk on the ship. He turned and started walking, not looking back to see if she followed, because he was afraid that if he looked back, he might realize how insane this decision was. But he heard her footsteps behind him, heavy and uneven because of her damaged leg, and he felt something in his chest that might have been relief. They walked through the station together, the small human and the towering alien warrior, and everyone who saw them stepped aside with wide eyes and whispered questions. Danny led her to docking bay 17 where his ship waited. A battered old cargo hauler called the Wanderer that had seen better days 20 years ago. He opened the hatch and stepped inside, and she had to duck low to fit through the doorway. The interior was cramped and worn, with cargo straps hanging from the walls and a small living space that barely fit one person. This is it, Danny said as he gestured around the modest cabin. Not much, but it flies. The Torvani stood in the center of the room, her head brushing the ceiling, and she looked at him with eyes that searched for answers she clearly could not find. You spent everything, she said slowly. I heard the auctioneer say your bid was your entire wealth. And you spent it all on me. Danny nodded because he could not deny the truth. Why? She demanded, and her 4 hands clenched into fists at her sides. What do you want, human? What do you expect me to do for you? Danny looked up at her. This broken warrior who had killed hundreds in the arena. This being who could crush him with one hand if she chose. And he gave her the only answer he had. I do not know yet, he admitted. But I know I could not leave you there. She stared at him for a long moment. And then she shook her head slowly. You are either the bravest creature I have ever met, she said quietly, or the most foolish. Danny managed a small smile despite the fear in his heart. Probably both, he said. Now sit down before you fall over, because that leg looks like it hurts. She hesitated. And then she lowered herself onto the cargo bench. With a wince of pain she could not hide, Danny turned to the pilot's seat and began the startup sequence. And as the engines hummed to life, he tried not to think about what tomorrow would bring. He had no credits, no plan, and an alien gladiator sitting in his cargo hold. But he also had something he had not felt in years. He had a reason to keep going. The Wanderer drifted through the darkness between stars, and inside the cramped cabin, 2 very different beings tried to understand each other. Danny had given Kethra his bunk because it was the only bed on the ship, and she had been too exhausted to argue when he insisted she take it her. Injured leg throbbed with a deep pain that had become as familiar to her as breathing. And she lay there in the darkness, listening to the human sleep on the cold metal floor just a few feet away. She could not make sense of him. In her 15 years as a gladiator, she had learned that every creature in the galaxy wanted something. And kindness was always a mask hiding darker intentions. The slavers wanted profit. The arena masters wanted blood, and the crowds wanted entertainment. But this human seemed to want nothing at all when morning came, marked only by the ship's internal clock since there was no sun in the void. Danny woke up stiff and sore from sleeping on the floor. He made 2 cups of something he called coffee from his small supply, and he handed one to Kethra without asking if she wanted it. "We need to talk," she said as she wrapped her 4 hands around the warm cup. "I need to know what you expect from me." Danny sat down in the pilot chair and turned it to face her. "I expect nothing," he said simply. "That is not possible." Kethra replied with frustration in her voice. "You spent 12,000 credits on me, and no creature spends that much without wanting something in return." Danny was quiet for a moment, and then he pulled out a small datapad and began tapping at its surface. "On my world," he said slowly as he worked, "there was a time when humans owned other humans, and it was one of the darkest periods in our history." Kethra watched him with narrowed eyes, not understanding where this was going. "My ancestors fought a war to end it," Danny continued, "and millions of them died because they believed that no person should ever be property. That freedom was not something that could be bought or sold or taken away." He finished what he was doing on the datapad and then stood up and walked over to her. "Give me your identification chip," he said. Kethra hesitated, because the chip embedded in her wrist was the thing that marked her as property. The thing that tracked her and controlled her, and proved that she belonged to someone else. But she extended her arm and let him scan it with the datapad. Danny tapped a few more commands, and then he turned the screen to show her what he had done. Her ownership documents now showed her name as the owner, and the status line read "Free Citizen" instead of "Property." "I do not understand," Kethra said as she stared at the screen. "You are free," Danny told her. "I transferred ownership to you, which means you own yourself now, and no one can ever sell you again." Kethra felt something strange happening in her chest, something that might have been fear or hope. "Why would you do this?" she demanded, and her voice came out harsher than she intended. "Because it was the right thing to do," Danny said with a shrug. "Because where I come from, we believe that every person deserves to choose their own path." "Your beliefs are foolish," Kethra said. But there was no heat in her words. "In my culture, warriors are either victors or they are owned, and freedom is not given as a gift. It must be earned through blood and combat." Danny smiled slightly and shook his head. "I do not care about your culture's rules," he said without any anger in his voice. "I care about what is right, and keeping you as property would not be right." Kethra set down the coffee cup and stood up slowly, towering over him in the small cabin. "And what do you expect me to do now?" she asked. "I cannot fight anymore. I have no clan, no home, no purpose. I can take you wherever you want to go," Danny offered. "Any station, any colony, anywhere in the galaxy. Just tell me, and I will get you there." "And if I have nowhere to go?" Danny thought about that for a moment. "Then you can stay here," he said. "I could use the company. And this ship is big enough for 2 if we do not mind being cramped." Kethra stared at him for a long time, searching his face for any sign of deception, any hint that this was some elaborate trick. She found nothing but honesty in his eyes. "I do not trust you," she said finally. "That is fair," Danny replied. "You do not know me, but you are still free to leave whenever you choose." He turned back to the pilot controls and began plotting a course for the nearest trade station where he might find. Kethra lowered herself back onto the bunk and watched him work, her mind spinning with thoughts she could not organize. She had been captured at the age of 12, when raiders attacked her clan settlement, and she had spent every day since then as property. First as a slave in the mines, and then as a fighter in the arena after her owners discovered her talent for violence. Freedom was a word that had lost all meaning to her long ago, but now this strange human had given it back to her like it was nothing, like 12,000 credits, and his entire future meant less than her right to choose her own path. "Human," she said quietly. Danny turned to look at her. "My name is Danny," he corrected. Gently. "Danny," she repeated, and the name felt strange on her tongue. Why did you sleep on the floor? He seemed confused by the question. Because you needed the bed more than I did, he said. Your leg is injured, and the floor is cold and hard. And I thought you should be comfortable. You thought about my comfort? Of course, Danny said, like it was the most obvious thing in the galaxy. Psychithra fell silent again. And she lay back on the bunk as the ship hummed around them. She did not sleep that night either, because every time she closed her eyes, she saw the human giving up his bed for her, giving up his credits for her, giving up everything for a stranger who had done nothing to deserve such kindness in the arena. She had learned that survival meant looking out for yourself and trusting no one, but this human seemed to operate by different rules. Rules that made no sense, but somehow felt more real than anything she had experienced in 15 years of blood and chains. When morning came again, she made a decision. I will stay, she told Danny as he woke up. For now, I will stay and help you with your work. And perhaps I will understand you better. Danny smiled. And it was a warm smile that held no expectation. I would like that, he said. Kethra nodded slowly. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something that might have been hope. 3 weeks had passed since Danny freed Kethra, and in that time, everything had changed. The Thervani warrior had proven herself invaluable, using her knowledge of rim space to find trade routes that Danny had never known existed. And their profits had slowly begun to climb. She knew which stations paid the best prices for certain goods, which captains could be trusted, and which ones would cheat you, and which sectors to avoid because pirates controlled them. Danny found himself relying on her more each day, not just for her expertise, but for her company. They had fallen into a comfortable routine where he piloted the ship while she handled negotiations. Because most aliens took one look at her massive form and decided not to argue about prices. Her legs still pained her, and she walked with a heavy limp that would never fully heal, but she never complained. And she never asked for anything. Danny had tried to give her a share of their earnings, but she refused every time. I have no use for credits, she would say. I have food and shelter and purpose, and that is more than I have had in many years. He stopped arguing after the 4th attempt because he could see that she meant it. They were docked at a refueling station called Krava's Rest when the trouble found them. Danny had gone inside to pay for their fuel, while Kethra waited by the ship, and when he came back out, he found 3 figures standing between him and the Wanderer. They were Vrexian enforcers, tall insectoid beings with chitinous armor and blades that grew naturally from their forearms. And they worked for the arena masters who controlled the gladiator pits across a dozen stations. Human, the lead enforcer, clicked in a voice that sounded like breaking glass. You have caused problems for our employers. Danny stopped walking and kept his hands visible at his sides. I do not know what you are talking about, he said calmly. The Thervani you purchased was arena property, the enforcer continued. And you had no right to free her, because freeing slaves undermines the entire system that our employers have built. She is not a slave anymore, Danny replied. I transferred ownership to her legally, and she is a free citizen now. The enforcer made a sound that might have been laughter. Legal documents mean nothing to us, he said. Our employers want their property returned, and if you refuse, they want you dead as an example to others who might consider similar foolishness. Danny felt his heart pounding in his chest, but he did not let his fear show. I'm not giving her back, he said. The 3 enforcers raised their blade arms, and Danny knew he was about to die. Then Kethra stepped out from behind the Wanderer, and she moved with a speed that seemed impossible for someone with her injury. She placed herself between Danny and the enforcers, and even though she carried no weapons, she looked more dangerous than all 3 of them combined. You will not touch him, she said in a voice that carried the weight of 200 arena kills. The lead enforcer hesitated, because even a wounded Thervani warrior was not something to take lightly. Kethra, the Unbroken, he said slowly. We heard you could not fight anymore. I heard many things in the arena, Kethra replied. Most of them were lies told by those too afraid to face me. And you should ask yourself if you want to find out the truth. The enforcers looked at each other, and Danny could see them calculating the odds. This is not over, the lead enforcer finally said. Our employers will send others, more prepared and more numerous. And eventually, they will reclaim what belongs to them. Let them try, Kethra growled. I have killed better warriors than whatever they send. The enforcers backed away slowly, never taking their eyes off Kethra. And then they disappeared into the station's crowded corridors. Danny let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. That was close, he said quietly. Kethra turned to face him, and her amber eyes held something he had not seen before. They will come back, she said. The arena masters do not forgive those who challenge their authority, and they will keep sending hunters until one of them succeeds. Then we will deal with them when they come. Danny said. Kethra shook her head slowly. You do not understand what you have done, she said. By freeing me, you have made yourself an enemy of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the Outer Rim. I do not regret it, Danny told her honestly. She stared at him for a long moment, and then she asked the question that had been burning in her mind since the auction. Why did you defend me just now? You could have told them where I was hiding. You could have saved yourself and let them take me. But instead you stood there and refused to give me up. Danny shrugged like it was the most natural thing in the galaxy. Because you are my friend, he said simply. Kethra felt that strange sensation in her chest again. The one she did not have a name for among my people. There is something called a life debt, she said slowly. When one warrior saves another, the debt must be repaid in kind. I do not want you to owe me anything, Danny said. That is not how it works, Kethra replied. You gave me freedom, and now I owe you my life. And I will protect you until that debt is paid. Danny shook his head with a slight smile. I do not want your debt, he said. I want your friendship, because those are two very different things. Kethra did not know how to respond to that in her culture. Relationships were built on obligation and honor and the exchange of favors. But Danny seemed to operate outside of those rules, offering kindness without expecting anything in return. You confuse me, she admitted. I get that a lot, Danny said with a laugh. Now come on, we need to get off this station before those enforcers change their minds. They boarded the Wanderer and lifted off within the hour, leaving Krava's Rest behind them as the station faded into the distance. Kethra sat in the co-pilot seat and watched Danny guide them through the stars. I am not staying because of the life. Dad, she said suddenly. Danny glanced at her with curiosity. I am staying because I choose to, she continued. Because for the first time in 15 years, I have found someone who does not see me as a weapon or a tool or a piece of property. Danny smiled, and it reached his eyes. I'm glad you are staying, he said. Kethra nodded and turned to look out at the endless darkness of space. She had spent her whole life fighting for survival, killing because she had no other choice, serving masters who saw her as nothing more than entertainment for the masses. But now she had something different. She had a friend who valued her for who she was, not what she condoned she was. Beginning to understand that perhaps the human way of seeing the world was not so foolish after all. Perhaps kindness without expectation was the strongest thing in the galaxy. She would protect Danny with her life, not because she owed him, but because he had shown her that some beings were worth protecting, and that was a lesson she would never forget. The arena masters had hired the best, and his name was Zelos. He was Acrylic's bounty hunter whose body had been rebuilt with cybernetic enhancements until only half of him remained organic. and he had a reputation for never failing to capture his targets in 20 years of hunting escaped slaves. He had never lost a single bounty. Zealous tracked the Wanderer across 3 star systems, following their fuel purchases and cargo manifests until he knew exactly where they would be. They landed on a frontier colony called New Haven to pick up a shipment of medical supplies. And Zealous was waiting for them. Danny and Kethra had just finished loading the cargo when the attack came. The first plasma bolt hit the ground beside Danny's feet, and he dove behind a stack of crates as 2 combat drones swooped down from the rooftop. Kethra reacted on instinct, grabbing a metal beam from a nearby construction pile and swinging it with all 4 arms. As one of the drones came too close, the machine shattered into pieces, but another took its place immediately. "Danny, get to the ship," she shouted as she fought, but Danny did not run. He had spotted Zealous on a nearby platform, aiming a plasma rifle directly at Kethra's back while she was distracted by the Fae drones. Danny did not think about what he was doing. He just moved. He threw himself between Kethra and the rifle just as Zealous fired, and the plasma bolt tore through his shoulder with a burst of agony that stole his breath, hit the ground hard, and could not get back up. "Danny!" Kethra screamed. She turned from the drones and saw him lying there with blood pooling beneath him, and something inside her snapped. The next few seconds were a blur of violence, as Kethra became the warrior she had been in the arena. Fast and brutal and utterly without mercy, she destroyed the remaining drones with her bare hands, tearing them apart like they were made of paper. And then she advanced on Zealous with murder in her eyes. But Zealous was not afraid. He pressed a button on his wrist, and a shock collar around Danny's neck activated, one that he had attached while Danny lay unconscious for those brief seconds. Danny screamed as electricity coursed through his body. "Stop," Zealous commanded, "or I will increase the voltage until his heart stops." Kethra froze in place, her 4 hands clenched into fists. "You were always going to be captured," Zealous said calmly. "The arena masters have too many resources and too much reach, and all your human friend did was delay the inevitable. Let him go," Kethra said through gritted teeth. "That depends on you," Zealous replied. "Surrender yourself, and I will release him to seek medical attention. But if you fight, I will kill him slowly while you watch." Danny tried to speak, but the pain was too much. He managed to lift his head and look at Kethra with eyes that begged her to run, to save herself, to forget about him and find freedom somewhere far from here. But Kethra was not looking at his eyes. She was looking at the wound in his shoulder, the wound he had taken to protect her. She thought about the auction, where a broke human had spent everything he had on a broken gladiator. She thought about the nights he had slept on the cold floor so she could have his bed. She thought about the way he had called her his friend, not because he wanted anything from her, but simply because he cared. Humans were strange creatures. She realized they did not calculate worth the way other species did. They did not measure lives against credits or value against usefulness. They simply loved, without reason, without logic, without any expectation of return. And now this human had taken a plasma bolt that was meant for her because he could not bear to watch her die. "If I surrender," Kethra said slowly, "you will let him live?" "You have my word," Zealous replied. "The arena masters want you, not him. And killing humans tends to attract unwanted attention from their governments." Danny managed to croak out a single word: "Run." Kethra looked down at him with eyes that held more emotion than she had felt in 15 years. "I cannot," she said softly, "because you taught me something important." "Danny Cole." She turned to face Zealous and lowered her hands to her sides. "You taught me that some things matter more than freedom." Zealous smiled, if such an expression could be called a smile on his half-mechanical face. "A wise choice," he said, as he produced a set of restraints. Kethra let him bind her 4 arms without resistance, and she did not look away from Danny, even as Zealous dragged her toward his ship. I will find you," Danny whispered. Though he did not know if she could hear him, Zelos deactivated the shock collar and left Danny lying in a pool of his own blood. As he took Kethra away, the last thing Danny saw, before he lost consciousness, was her face disappearing through the hatch of the bounty hunter's ship. And the last thing he felt was determination stronger than anything he had ever known. He would get her back. He did not care what it cost. He would get her back when Danny woke up. He was in a hospital bed with bandages wrapped around his shoulder and a human doctor standing over him. "You are lucky to be alive," the doctor said. "The plasma bulb missed your heart by 2 inches. And someone dragged you to our clinic before you bled out." Danny sat up despite the pain and immediately regretted it. "Where is she?" he demanded. "The Tovani who was with me, where did they take her?" The doctor, whose name tag read Grace, shook her head sadly. "I am sorry," she said, "but I heard the bounty hunter's destination over the station come, and he is taking her back to the arena on Varak Station." "For what?" Grace hesitated before answering. "Public execution," she said quietly. "They want to make an example of her to discourage other slaves from dreaming about freedom." Danny threw off the blankets and tried to stand, but his legs gave out beneath him. "You cannot leave," Grace said as she caught him. "You have lost too much blood, and your shoulder needs time to heal." "I do not have time," Danny said through clenched teeth. "She surrendered herself to save me, and I am not going to let her die because of that." Grace looked at him for a long moment, and then she sighed. "You humans and your stubborn hearts," she muttered. "At least let me give you something for the pain and some supplies for the journey." Danny nodded gratefully. An hour later, he limped out of the hospital with his arm in a sling and his ship impounded for unpaid docking fees. He had no credits, no weapons, and only one working arm. He had no logical reason to believe he could succeed, but he was going to try anyway because that was what humans did. Danny stole his own ship from impound because he had no credits to pay the release fee, and the alarm was still blaring behind him as he pushed the Wanderer into open space. His shoulder screamed with every movement, and the pain medication was already wearing off. But he could not afford to slow down. The execution was scheduled for tomorrow, and Varak Station was 18 hours away at maximum speed. He pushed the engines harder than he had ever pushed them before, and the old ship groaned in protest but did not fail him during the long journey. Danny had time to think about what he was doing. He had no weapons, no backup, and no plan beyond getting to Kethra before they killed Hera. Smart person would have cut their losses and disappeared into the galaxy. A logical person would have recognized that one injured human could not fight an entire arena organization, but Danny had never claimed to be smart or logical. He only knew that Kethra had surrendered herself to save his life, and he could not live with himself if he let her die for that choice. The transport carrying Kethra was slower than the Wanderer, and Danny caught up to it just 3 hours from Varak Station. He opened a channel and broadcast on all frequencies. "Transport vessel. This is the cargo hauler Wanderer," he said into the com. "You have someone on board who belongs with me, and I am asking you to release her." The response came quickly, dripping with amusement. "Is this the human who bought the Gladiator?" the transport captain asked. "We were told you might try something foolish, but I did not expect you to actually show up." "She's not property," Danny said firmly. "She is a free citizen, and you have no right to hold her. Rights mean nothing out here. Human, and you are one small ship against our armed transport. So what exactly do you think you can do?" Danny looked at the transport on his scanner, noting its size, its weapons, and its engine configuration. Then he looked at the Wanderer's controls and made a decision that any sane pilot would have called suicide. "I'm going to get her back," Danny said. One way or another, he cut the com channel and angled his ship directly at the transport. The captain must have thought he was bluffing, because no warning shots came until Danny was already too close to stop the Wanderer, slammed into the transport's engine block at full speed. And both ships shuddered with the impact. Alarms filled Danny's cockpit as systems failed across the board. But he had aimed carefully, and the collision had done exactly what he intended. The transport was crippled, its engines dead, and it was drifting helplessly in space. Danny's ship was in bad shape too, but it was still functional enough to dock. He sealed his helmet, grabbed the only weapon he could find, a fire extinguisher from the emergency kit, and climbed through the airlock into the transport inside. Chaos reigned. The crew was scrambling to deal with hull breaches and system failures, and no one expected the injured human to actually board them. Danny moved through the corridors with the fire extinguisher raised like a club, and he only had to use it twice when crew members got in his way. He found the holding cells in the lower deck, and there was Kethra behind an energy barrier, her forearms bound and her head bowed. But when she saw him, her eyes went wide with disbelief. "Danny?" She breathed. "How are you here?" "I rammed their ship," he said as he searched for the barrier controls. "You did what?" "I rammed their ship," he repeated, like it was the most normal thing in the galaxy. "Now hold on, I am going to get you out." He found the control panel and smashed it with the fire extinguisher until the energy barrier flickered and died. Keth Rio stepped out of the cell and stared at him like he was some kind of impossible dream. "You came for me," she said. "Of course. I came for you," Danny replied. "Now, let's get out of here before they realize their prisoner is escaping." They fought their way back to the airlock together, Kethra using her bound hands as a weapon, and Danny swinging his fire extinguisher at anything that moved. By the time they reached the Wanderer, both ships were filling with smoke, and the transport captain was screaming threats over the com that neither of them bothered to answer. Danny sealed the airlock and limped to the pilot's seat while Kethra worked on freeing herself from her restraints. The Wanderer's engines barely responded, but there was enough power left to push them away from the transport and into open space. They drifted there for a long time, too damaged to jump to hyperspace, waiting for rescue or death. Whichever came first, Kethra sat down beside Danny and watched him struggle to keep them alive with one arm and a ship that was falling apart around them. "Why?" she asked finally. Danny knew what she was really asking. "Because you are my family now," he said simply. "And where I come from, you do not abandon family." Kethra was silent for a moment, and then she asked another question. "What does that word mean to humans, family?" Danny thought about it before answering. "It means the people you would die for," he said. "The ones who matter more than yourself, more than logic, more than survival. And it does not matter if you share blood or species or anything else. Because family is a choice. And you chose me?" "Yes," Danny said without hesitation. "I chose you the moment I saw you in that auction, and I would choose you again. And I would choose you 1,000 times if I had to." Kethra felt something wet on her face, and she realized with shock that she was crying. She had not cried since she was a child, since before the raiders took her, since before she learned that tears were weakness and weakness meant death. But now she could not stop. "I understand now," she said quietly. "I understand what makes humans different." Danny looked at her with tired eyes. "What is that?" "It is not your strength or your technology or your numbers," she said. "It is this stubborn, illogical, beautiful refusal to accept that some lives are worth less than others." She reached out with one of her freed hands and took his. "You taught me that kindness is not weakness," she continued. "You taught me that caring without expecting anything in return is the bravest thing a being can do." Danny squeezed her hand gently. "Does that mean you are staying?" Kethra managed a small smile through her tears. "I am not staying because of debt," she said. "And I am not staying because I have nowhere else to go." "Then why?" "Because you are my family now," she said. "And I'm choosing you the way you chose me." Danny smiled. And despite the pain and the danger and the uncertainty of their future, he felt something warm in his chest. A rescue ship found them 6 hours later, responding to their distress beacon. And the pilot was shocked to find a human and a Taurani laughing together in a ship that should not have been able to fly. They towed the Wanderer to a repair station. And Danny and Kethra stood together on the observation deck, watching the workers patch their battered vessel back together. "What do we do now?" Kethra asked. "The same thing we have been doing," Danny replied. "We fly, we haul cargo, we help each other, and we face whatever comes next together." Kethra nodded slowly. "Together," she repeated. And the word felt right. They had started as strangers, a broke human and a broken gladiator. Two beings who had no reason to trust each other. But now they were something more. They were family, and in a galaxy full of creatures who measured worth in credits and power and usefulness. That was the most valuable thing of all.